Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are so glad to see you all here. I mean, I personally am glad, but I think we're all glad. I'm really excited to introduce Amelia Glaser, who is a literature professor at UC San Diego. She was a grad student here. Yay! She is a specialist in Yiddish, Ukrainian, and Russian. She writes about the multi-ethnic spaces of what was the Russian Empire and then became its successor states, the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine. She also writes about Yiddish in a global and transnational perspective. She has expertise in poetry, in translation, and in left-wing and radical politics. These all come together in her recent, really marvelous, award-winning book, Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle, From Scottsboro to Palestine. This book won the Jordan Schnitzer Award in Jewish Literature and Linguistics, and it is really great, and you should all read it. Amelia, let me just say, this is the Clara Sumpf lecture. This is the second half of the Clara Sumpf annual lecture series, yes, in that every year we bring somebody to Stanford who gives one talk in Yiddish and one talk in English. And it's, sometimes we worry that there might not be enough people who can give an interesting talk in English and a competent talk in Yiddish. And we are so grateful to see that, in fact, there's no need to worry, and there's all kinds of scholars sort of coming up and available to do these things. And it was just wonderful to hear Amelia give a talk in Yiddish, which was competent and interesting. And now we're getting to hear her talk in English. It's named after, so this talk series is named after Clara Sumpf. Clara Sumpf was a resident of Palo Alto who, when Amelia and I arrived here together at the same time in 1998, Clara Sumpf was sort of around campus. She would attend events. She sometimes attended sort of frighteningly classes. She attended my entire class in sort of Jewish literature. She was an incredibly interesting, erudite, opinionated, small person. And she really came from this, the world, I think, that Amelia describes in her book, right? So Clara Sumpf was this, she was a person who remembered protests in New York in the 20s and 30s. She remembered her father. She grew up speaking Yiddish, right, in New York. She remembered her father looking at New York City mounted policemen and saying, "Those are die Kosaken." Those are the Cossacks, which is kind of a wonderful, moment when she told us about this in my class, and in a way I feel like it informs some of what that kind of experience informs some of what goes into your book. Mm-hmm. So Clara Sumpf would have loved Amelia's book. And I think she would have loved the talk that we are now about to hear from Amelia. Let us welcome her.
Thank you so much, first of all, to Gabriella, who was not only my graduate school professor, but also really a role model in her work. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you also to Shana and to Eva, to Romy, and to the invisible to us right now workers who have made Stanford such a beautiful space for working and learning. It's really a special honor to be here. As Gabriella mentioned, I got to meet Clara Sumpf before her death when I first arrived in 1998. I'd actually been on a Yiddish summer program right before starting graduate school with Clara Sumpf's partner, sort of her third major life partner, David Sachs, his son, and his son's wife. And it was his son who had said, my father's partner, Clara Sumpf, is really interesting and she knows Yiddish and you should really meet her. And so I went to meet her and she was this lovely, warm woman and we had this beautiful conversation over lunch. And I was like in my early 20s and I was having all sorts of like identity crisis issues and I just started to study Yiddish, and we had this conversation where she was like, so what led you to study Yiddish? Like, did you speak it in your family? And I was like, no, actually I come from this like, mixed parentage. My father was raised Jewish, my mother was raised Protestant, and here I am studying Yiddish, trying to sort of sort myself out. And she turned to her boyfriend, her partner, David, and said to her, like sort of as if continuing a conversation that had started long before I arrived, see, what's wrong with her? You tell me, what's wrong with her? Like clearly sort of discussing like halakhic Judaism and what that means. But just this like beautiful kind of, she didn't mean to affirm anything for me, but somehow she did by just her tone of voice. I was like, yeah, what's wrong with me? I'm fine. But she was very encouraging, and she also had taught Yiddish at Stanford. She came out in the 70s where she taught Yiddish literature in English, and it was really beautiful to her that Yiddish was experiencing this revival at Stanford, and of course she was excited to come to these events. So I attended these talks as a graduate student. It's really a pleasure to be here as someone who has continued in my Yiddishist pursuits. What I want to focus on today is something that may help us to untangle the history, the sort of fraught history, and sometimes surprisingly aligned history between the groups living in Ukraine. And I've tried to mix a little bit of what I've done in my work on the 1930s with what's happening right now, and also with some of my newer work, which is on contemporary Ukrainian poetry, which I'll try to get to at the end. So this is a photograph. You see the photograph here from March 3rd, 2022. A Russian missile had just struck a TV tower and killed about 5 civilians near the structure of the Babyn Yar Memorial. And President Volodymyr Zelensky said shortly afterwards in his address, he gives these regular addresses to all Ukrainians, we all died again in Babyn Yar from a missile attack. The address was posted to his social media pages, as his addresses usually are, this time with a Hebrew translation, which was interesting. And the idea that Ukrainians could and should identify the missile attack on Babyn Yar as a national tragedy, and also identify Babyn Yar, the mass killing in 1941, as a national tragedy, I believe is due in large part to a changing conversation that's been taking place in Ukraine, particularly over the last 9 years. Since the 2013-2014 Maidan Revolution of Dignity, the Revoluция Hidnosti in Ukraine, Ukrainian discussions about national memory and tragedy have broadened to become much more inclusive, to be really about a kind of civic identity and not a national, ethno-national identity. Some people have called this a civic turn, and this is this widespread shift in what it means to identify as Ukrainian. Is it your parentage, or is it something else? Is it your citizenship and your fact that you are living in this place? Some people have called it a civic turn, and this means that people of Russian descent, of Jewish descent, of Roma descent, of Tatar descent are calling themselves Ukrainian, who a decade ago might have qualified their Ukrainianness. I think one of the ways that this has happened is through the extension of specific signifiers for collective memory to include broader social groups. In my last book that I'll be talking about, I use this term passwords. I translated it to parolin yesterday when I was speaking in Yiddish, but passwords is the term I use in the book. These are untranslatable terms that admit other groups into a collective fold. In the case of Zelensky's quote here, he's linking all Ukrainians to the mass tragedy of the Holocaust. So Ukrainian-Jewish relations in Ukraine have a troubled history. I don't want to whitewash this. These were 2 groups that had been marginalized in the Tsarist Empire, and at various points they came into conflict and into competition. We can think of plenty of examples, the 17th century Khmelnytsky uprisings against Poland that killed thousands of Jews as collateral damage. The immediate post-Soviet period, when Ukrainians and Jews sometimes vied in ways that were either spoken or unspoken for airspace to commemorate their respective genocides that had touched both groups during the 20th century. Jews struggled to commemorate the Holocaust, which had been silenced during the period of the USSR, and Ukrainians struggled to commemorate the Holodomor of the 1930s, the Ukrainian famine. This was a partially state-inflicted genocide that had also led to the death of millions of Ukrainians. The relationship between Jews, Ukrainians, and the Russian imperial presence that ruled over that territory of Ukraine, whether imperial or Soviet, is a complex one. But there have also been moments of rapprochement. And this has included moments during the Soviet period when, both thanks to and also in spite of Soviet ideology, members of the two groups looked to one another to help to describe their own group's struggle. So this is drawn, as Gabriela mentioned, in part from my recent book, Songs in Dark Times, which treats Yiddish poets in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, especially the United States, during the interwar period. And these were poets, the poets that interest me are left-identified poets who wrote about other groups' struggles, other ethno-national minorities' struggles. And what I found from looking at this moment in Yiddish poetry is that Yiddish writers, and this is throughout the modernist decades of the 1910s and 1920s especially, were starting to generate a language for talking about suffering. But in the 1930s, they used this language, they used the passwords already generated within this language to talk about other groups' trauma. And I spoke about the Scottsboro case yesterday in Yiddish. So Soviet and Soviet-aligned writers were writing largely about other groups. This is what I call in my book the age of internationalism. And I date this, I mean, you can quibble about the exact dates of this tendency, but I date it beginning at around 1927 with the third period under Stalin, through partway into World War II when Stalin officially dissolved the Communist International and internationalism shifted. The Jewish writers, and especially the writers in Yiddish who were doing this, were in a process of changing the meaning of we. And they were doing this partly in alignment with the Communist Party, and they were doing this partly out of their own interest in becoming more enlightened individuals. They were changing the meaning of we from we Jews to we workers of the world, an inclusive we that included other groups. They tended to publish in Soviet and Soviet-aligned venues. You see here an example of one, Die Rote Welt, which was published in Kharkiv, especially in the late 20s, moving right into the very, very early 30s. And they wrote about Ukrainians, the Spanish Civil War, African Americans, and Chinese workers, to name just a few. They also translated. They brought other groups' struggles literally to bear on their own, and in some cases they allowed other groups' struggles to serve as proxies for their own. Increasingly, throughout the 1930s, you find Jewish writers who, rather than kind of showing a certain empathy for other groups, are actually using other groups as a Trojan horse for talking about a group struggle. And you especially see this in the case of translations from Ukrainian into Yiddish in the late 1930s. So in some cases, Jews and Ukrainians looked specifically at one another. These are groups that cohabitated, at least in the Ukrainian territory of the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union. And this was a way of explaining their own condition of alienation in this large imperial landscape. I'm going to focus on just one case study. This is the Yiddish poet Dovid Hofshteyn, who you see here at the left. And he was an innovator with language and verse, really a wonderful, wonderful modernist Yiddish poet. But he also translated the 19th century Ukrainian romantic poet Taras Shevchenko. Hofshteyn spent a year in Palestine in the 1920s and eventually returned to the Soviet Union in 1926. He'd been an important modernist in the 1910s and early 20s. And after he returned to the Soviet Union, Hofshteyn continued to kind of support the Soviet Union outwardly, but quietly we have lots of letters where he would complain to friends about the increasing strictures on Jewish cultural expression. He wrote to his friend and cousin Hirsch Blostein in 1932 that Soviet Yiddish culture lacked Kulturtraditions, or cultural traditions. Hofshteyn had deep roots in the Ukrainian territories. He had supposedly actually started writing poetry in Ukrainian. I have yet to find any examples of this poetry. I would love to find it. If any of you know of any, Andriy, maybe, please tell me. He was born in this small town of Korostyshev. You can see it up here to the left, in the Kiev region in 1889. And this isn't terribly far from Marintsy, where Shevchenko was born in 1814. Hofshteyn's poetic career began in earnest in interwar Kiev in a time of alternating Ukrainian and Bolshevik governments. Ukraine, which had been marginal to Jewish culture compared to centers like Vilna and Warsaw, at that point started to move to the center of Yiddish literature. And this was in the years especially immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution throughout the Ukrainian Civil War. Hofshteyn's early poetry about Ukraine places a Jewish alienated subject into a hostile Ukrainian landscape. His pogrom poem, Ukraina, which was published in 1922 in the book Troyer, or Sorrow, began with the this idea of an incredibly hostile space, and it's ironic. It's an ironic poem. So I'll just read the very beginning of that. This is Ukraine. Blutig Neuente und blutig Fremde, faste Vasilkov und noch, right? Bloody near and bloody far, faste Vasilkov, and more and more. And this is this book about the pogroms that had been taking place in the late teens through 1920. He had written earlier about this sort of, kind of Whitmanesque Wanderlust style poetry. This is from 1919. A dank ich wander wegen Breite, vermiede Gliedel wandel Stoib. So writing in the wake of the horrific pogroms that took place during the Ukrainian Civil War, sometimes known as the Russo-Polish War, Hofshteyn used these names, Fastov, Vasilkov, and other names of shtetls as passwords that evoke a collective understanding of specifically Ukrainian pogroms, very much in the same way that names like Nemirov and Tulchin denoted the pogroms that had been carried out by the Cossacks under Khmelnytsky in the 17th century. Only in 1936 did Hofshteyn dedicate a book of poems to the city of his poetic origins, where he remembered the old Kiev from 15 years earlier, Zurück mit 15 weite Jahr, and rejoices that now everything is much better. So this is the top quote: Dein alte Pracht wird jetzt bekleidet mit neuer Macht, mit neuer Fried. Your old magnificence is now dressed in new power, in new happiness. And this is a book called Kiev that was dedicated to Kiev on the occasion of the capital shifting from Kharkiv to Kiev. So this marks a turning point in Hofshteyn's writing. He would again write about violence during World War II, but at that point he starts writing not only about violence against Jews specifically, but about violence to Ukraine as a whole. For example, we have this second poem that you see on this slide. This is his 1944 poem, also titled Ukraina, like his 1922 poem, but it addresses Ukraine in the second person familiar. But this time, Hofshteyn casts Ukraine as a child that has emerged from the violence of the Civil War and, of course, the beginning of World War II, the Nazi occupation of parts of Ukraine. He compares Ukraine to a young woman who continues to live and has motherly pain. So I'll read to you this short excerpt here. Von Reuch und von Bruch und von Asch und von Schand, ich del seh du der hebst dein zerschädigte Hand, und del hebt sich dein Kopf, was mit Blut is beklebt, ich del seh dein Gesicht, o erlebt, dein noch kinderscher Blick mit scheun mutterschen Zar, und es leucht scheun die Freud, was kommt on noch Gefahr, der Verstand, was kommt on noch Vertummlung und Greis, wie Wasser in Frühling von unter dem Eis. So you see this, it's an awakening poem after the Nazi occupation. Later in the poem, there's a kind of bizarre sexual unveiling. where Hofshteyn depicts a feminized Ukraine who, having been violated and battered, is now undressed, admired, and deemed ready for marriage. So I'll just read this next bit in the Yiddish, and you can follow along in English. Ich del sei und der hebt sich dein Guf, dein Gestalt, was die rechtlich von Kleider auf ihm kaum sich halt. Und es fallen die schmutzige Schmattes von Leib. Sie ist zu sein schon sa Kind, a erwachsens a Weib. Sie ist a lichtiger Kelpel mit Schönheit, was scheint. I durch Schand, I durch Spott, I durch Gewalttat von Feind. So, precisely who will betroth this new Ukraine, whether it's the people, Stalin, or Russia, is initially vague. But by the end of the poem, Hofshteyn seems to suggest that the husband is none other than perhaps the Yiddish poet. At the very end, we find it's Ukraine, my home, Ukraine, my land. It says Ukraine, mein Heim, Ukraine, mein Land. So the poem is both a reconciliation and a kind of sexual conquest, one that is, we can assume, not entirely consensual. The shame and mockery, Schand und Spott, mentioned in the opening and closing of the poem, allow for an interpretation that the Soviet people, including Jews, may have thrived at Ukraine's expense. He appears to be writing here on a couple of different registers, and that's really important to note. There's Soviet optimism, but there's also a realization of national tragedy. The new Ukraine will be better for internationalism, but Ukrainians will lose something of their beloved homeland. So what changed between the publication of Hofshteyn's first Ukraina from 1922 and his last Ukraina from 1944? So these are the covers of each, right? There's Troyo, you see that Marc Chagall did the front cover illustration, and then this is Kyiv from 1936. So this is actually not the cover that the second Ukraina appeared in, but it's the same aesthetic. So first of all, he'd gone to Palestine and come back. So he had to be very demonstrative about his reconciliation with the Soviet Union. He also, we should note, he had protested that Hebrew ought to be taught in Soviet schools. This was a huge problem for the various unions that he was speaking to in the early Soviet Union, and that was part of the reason that he left for a while. A little bit less obviously, upon his return, Hofshteyn was rewriting his poetics of alienation and marginality and national solidarity. He was focusing not on a rootless Jewish subject, but on the territorially rooted, if still marginal, Ukrainian subject. And this is something that we see in many Soviet and Soviet-aligned Yiddish writers in the late 1930s. In an effort to counter the rise of fascism and speak about solidarity across nations, writers often rewrote their own earlier poems about Jewish suffering to describe the struggles of others around the world. Hofshteyn was doing this in a couple of different ways. One was through the kind of weird programmatic poetry about Ukraine that I've just shared with you, slightly sexualized and so forth. But a more important turn in his poetry was happening also through translation. Enter Shevchenko. So Hofshteyn spent over a decade translating the Ukrainian romantic bard Taras Shevchenko. The sentiments of alienation that Hofshteyn had expressed in his own very early poetry were not that far from Shevchenko's 1938 observation while in exile from his native Ukraine that people are different abroad. It's hard to live with them. You'll have no one with whom to cry or talk. На чужинна не ті люди, тяжко з ними жити. Не з ким буде поплакати, не поговорити. So this poetics of alienation, whether of Jews in Ukraine or of Ukrainians in Russia, connects the two poets despite their utterly different relationships to Ukraine itself. So Hofshteyn's first translations of Shevchenko appeared in 1927. That was in the Yiddish edition of V. Drunin's Russian language biography of Shevchenko. He continued translating the Ukrainian poet throughout the 1930s. He published 3 book-length translations of Taras Shevchenko's poems and prose in 1939. In 1940, he became a member of the Communist Party. His colleagues, Kvitko and Markish, also became party members around the same time, Markish in 1939 and Kvitko in 1941, and their engagement with other national minorities played a direct role in this. The state publishing houses were gradually canonizing representative writers in Russian and other national minority languages. Pushkin became, the Soviet canonical writer of the imperial period in Russian. Sholem Aleichem eventually became the representative Yiddish writer, and Ukrainians were given Taras Shevchenko, who was widely celebrated in the spring of 1939 on the occasion of his 125th birthday. That year, the monument to Shevchenko was erected in Kyiv. Nikita Khrushchev, who then headed the Communist Party in Ukraine, delivered a speech at its unveiling. He said, all the peoples of the Soviet Union lovingly translate the poetry of Shevchenko, a Ukrainian poet, into their own languages. Kyiv's St. Vladimir University was also renamed Taras Shevchenko University that same year. So Shevchenko was translated into many languages of the Soviet peoples at that point. It's a kind of version of what Katerina Clark has called the Great Appropriation of earlier literature. Curiously, the Yiddish language monographs about Shevchenko that accompanied these 1939 celebratory volumes offer a kind of unlikely space for contemporary Jewish writers to discuss how a nation might assert its own cultural heritage in the Soviet Union. In a 1939 Yiddish language biography, Petro Altman writes, "Nowhere have the masses valued their kobzer as highly as here in our Soviet Union. Under the flag of Lenin, Stalin, all peoples live free in our country. They build and create their cultures to be national in form and socialist in content." And Hofshteyn, in a translator's introduction, remarks, "Only the proletariat under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party of Lenin, Stalin led the peasant to battle." So this discussion of the Ukrainians as a people shouldn't be overlooked as mere Stalinist rhetoric. I mean, it's a kind of convoy, right? You read the beginning of the introduction and you know that this book is kosher in the Soviet sense. But it's also a thinly coded language for discussing the role of national minorities in the Soviet Union. Altman and Hofshteyn appear to be suggesting that there is a place for closely examining a nation within a socialist state, but it's best if it's someone else's nation. The fact that Hofshteyn wrote programmatically about the Ukrainian romantic attests to an important aspect of his project. His translations were simultaneously ideological renderings of Shevchenko for a Soviet Jewish audience, and they were also, of course, linguistic renderings into Yiddish. He was steeping himself in the work of Shevchenko, who was canonized to, of course, great fanfare for his 125th birthday as a proto-Marxist poet. And Hofshteyn was rebuilding his relationship to the Soviet Union at the same time. And he was also rebuilding his relationship to his native Ukraine. So I'm going to share with you some of the translation decisions that he made. Beyond a sense of alienation as minority poets, Hofshteyn and Shevchenko shared some formal qualities. Hofshteyn's wordplay, alliteration, and internal rhymes complement Shevchenko's alliterative Ukrainian. So, we can take the last line of Shevchenko's arguably his most famous poem, Zapovit, or Testament, where Shevchenko's speaker prepares to leave the hills and valleys of Ukraine to meet his maker. And he says, in the original Ukrainian, he says in the second to last line, "Як понесе з України у синє море, кров ворожу, отоді я, і лани, і гори, все покину і полину до самого Бога. Молитися, а до того я не знаю Бога." So I'm guessing that not all of you know Ukrainian, but you can hear the alliteration here, right? We have the все покину і полину до самого Бога, and я не знаю Бога, and so forth. This is a translation by Peter Fadinsky into English, just to give you a sense of what it means. When it carries the hostile blood from Ukraine into the Azure Sea, I'll then forsake the fields and hills, I'll leave it all, taking wing to pray to God himself. Till then, I know not God. I can quibble with some of Fadinsky's translation decisions, but that's more or less the idea. What Hofshteyn does in his translation is to find another form of alliteration to match Shevchenko. So we have like verlosen und losen instead of pokino I polino. So Vettetrogton von Ukraine blut von Soines Glidel bis zum Jam dem Bloyen Dammelt, wel ich barg und niedel, alt verlosen und sich losen bis die Himmeln trogen, Leubgesangen und bis dammelt, kon kein Gott vermogen. So not only does Hofshteyn create a new internal rhyme, he has this verlosen, sich losen, but he preserves Shevchenko's vowel sounds. You see this kind of internal intertextual rhyme between boha, right, God, and trogen, to carry, or to carry oneself. And so he's doing this kind of intertextual work. A more virtuosic example of this preservation of sound happens even earlier in Testament. This is the red arrow up here. Lany shirokopoli. This is this beautiful word that Shevchenko uses to describe the broad-skirted or broad-brimmed fields. And most English translators don't really know what to do with that. The great broad fields is just fine for Fedinsky. But Hofshteyn comes up with die breitpoledicke lonkes, right? These sort of, again, broad-brimmed fields. So he, despite the linguistic distance between the Germanic Yiddish and the Slavic Ukrainian, he manages to turn this surprisingly long Ukrainian word into another surprisingly long Yiddish word. And these internal rhymes and alliterations are often the first thing that Shevchenko's other translators let go. Another quick example is this poem. There's a series of poems that Shevchenko wrote about his dumy, right? Dumy mayi, dumy mayi. A duma is very difficult to translate. It's a kind of genre of lyric, epic poem or song that was traditionally recited to the accompaniment of a musical instrument, often a stringed kobza, which was the sort of the instrument that Shevchenko played with by calling himself the kobzer or the kobza player. But this untranslatable duma can also mean a thought, an idea. It's sort of it's related to dumate, to think, and it constituted a genre of poem for Shevchenko. So it comes from this concept of thinking, but it's also like a little ditty or an idea. You could translate it song, poem, thought. Here, I think Fedinsky uses my thoughts, which is, again, I don't know if I would have done that, but it works. So Shevchenko compares these dumy, or these little poems or songs, to children, whom he then compares to flowers. So it's a multi-layered metaphor. And he says, my songs, dumy mayi, my flowers, children, kviti mayi diti. Hofshteyn, understanding duma to be this untranslatable password for Ukrainian tradition, renders the line, my songs, my dumas. Lieder meine, dumas meine. And this preserves the original Ukrainian duma while conveying at least one sense of the meaning into Yiddish. And he's assuming that many of his readers will get it. They also are living in Ukraine, some of them. Shevchenko wrote this poem in 1839 while he was still a student at the St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts. And you have this idea of a mother who's narrating this poem and comparing her songs to children, and later goes on and says, "V Ukrainu idiet diti." So, go to Ukraine, my children. Hofshteyn adds 3 syllables to the final line of that passage. He allows a long pause to emphasize the distinction between the song children who will travel to Ukraine, right? So, he writes, auf Ukraine geht jetzt Kindel, auf Ukraine geht jetzt singen. So go to Ukraine, my children, go to Ukraine and sing, go to our Ukraine. Interestingly, I actually spoke about this translation in Kyiv about 3 years ago, and a Yiddish teacher there said, that's really interesting, he uses auf Ukraine and not, to Ukraine. And auf Ukraine is sort of a literal translation of na Ukrainu, which would be to the Ukraine, as opposed to Ukraine. So he's using the Soviet standard of referring to Ukraine as a region of another larger country, as opposed to its own independent land. Clearly something that was important to the Soviet Yiddish that he was writing in. He adds this to this line, "Itzt" or now, to help with the syllables. It's a choice that adds urgency to the mother's request, as well as extending the meter to match Shevchenko's multisyllabic Ukrainian. But then he also forgoes the possessive our Ukraine, right? It's not necessarily our Ukraine in exactly the same way. Instead, he makes the children poems sing. So it's a solution that solves a few problems at once. He replaces the trochaic trimeter with this repeated trochaic tetrameter, but he also adds a near rhyme between Kinder und Singen, which adds more alliteration to his Yiddish to match Shevchenko's style and to match this idit dite. And in the process, then he also reinforces the metaphor of poems as children, but he also subtly shifts to a kind of political identity within the poem. He sacrifices this idea of a possessive our Ukraine, v naшу Ukraину, and softens the notion of Ukrainian nationalism to just say go to Ukraine or go to the Ukraine, right, in his Soviet Yiddish. So for Hofshteyn and for his Yiddish readers, Ukraine would have evoked spatial memory and even nostalgia, conjuring for some a sense of national ethos, as many Soviet Jews had come from that region. However, following the establishment of the Soviet Union in Ukraine in 1922, Ukraine as a territory couldn't be formally linked to the hope for a territorial Ukrainian sovereignty at the time that had still been present for Shevchenko in his wildest fantasies in the 19th century. So he's preserving Ukrainian untranslatables in his Yiddish translations of Shevchenko, but he's also acknowledging that Yiddish itself is a language of passwords and a language that's capable of preserving others' passwords. He's insisting here on preserving traces of the Ukrainian original, and his translation also shows this insistence on preserving certain cultural traditions, albeit not necessarily Yiddish cultural traditions, but Ukrainian ones. All right, so given what we can observe about Hofshteyn's immersion in Shevchenko's very anti-imperial poetry of the time, and also what we know of his own belief in cultural continuity and his concern about Kulturtraditios in Yiddish, how should we understand his more programmatic writings about Kiev in the 1930s? And this is, again, the cover of his book, Kiev, which came out in 1936. So by the 1930s, Russia was emerging as the dominant center of communist internationalism, despite the superficial various celebrations of diversity under the guise of Soviet Korenizatsiya, or the indigeneity project. Under Stalin's Soviet Nationalities Project, a nation could be considered a nation if it laid claim to a territory. As Ronald Suni has articulated, Soviet territorial administrative units, I'm quoting Suni here, provided clear political and territorial identities as alternatives to earlier religious and tribal solidarities. So this territorialization of official nationhood left Jews, most of whom weren't going to bother to move out to Birobidzhan, vulnerable to accusations of cosmopolitanism, anti-Soviet Zionism, or both. One result of this project was that the Soviet Jewish writers increasingly were relying on literary passwords from other national minorities to build various alliances to those other communities and to highlight the Jewish experience. It was okay, again, to talk about others' nations, but not about one's own. So just to read you one example from this book, here he's writing about the change that Kiev has undergone. So hat mein Stadt mich nahe begegnet und mit Freude rumgenommen, abgefahren von der Gegend in a Hauptstadt angekommen. And of course, Kiev had just become the Hauptstadt. It had just become the capital of Ukraine, taking it over from Kharkiv that had been the provisional capital while Kiev had declared, was part of the briefly independent Ukraine during the war, the Ukrainian Civil War. So many Jews were choosing to emphasize the territory of Ukraine as a territory that they were claiming as their own. And Hofshteyn was doing this with this book, Kiev. Kiev is celebrating this 1934 transfer from Kharkiv. And it includes all kinds of poems about, the destruction of churches, the rise of the Palace of the Pioneers. There's a poem about Dynamo Kiev that had been founded in the 1920s, the soccer team. And I think importantly also Tsian. This was about a Chinese hero that had been, described in various poems at the time in Ukrainian and also in Yiddish, who purportedly died defending Kiev from the White Army for the Soviet Union. There's also a poem called Mikhailovo Monastyr, the Mikhailov Monastery, which celebrates the demolition of the famous monastery in the 1930s and the replacement of it by a government building. There he writes, for the thugs who used to lie waiting in the monastery courtyard. This is such a great thing. So the book in its entirety is a kind of collection of impressions of a Kievan promised land and the descriptions of a new space that's done away with anti-Semitism. Here we find in From a Letter, it's another of the poems from that volume, "Vos is a ghetto, wees niet kenel, jeden tog for jeden togd dort." So it's about this kind of new thing. We've gotten rid of the ghetto. We now can all celebrate our new Kiev. At least one reader has argued that Hofshteyn's engagement with Ukraine might be read as evidence of a latent Zionist project, or at least of disillusionment with the Soviet Union as his homeland. Now, you should take this with a grain of salt, but it's interesting to bring in. And this was the Vilna Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever. I will advance the slide. Sutzkever, of course, was a famous modernist poet in Yiddish in Vilna who miraculously escaped the Vilna ghetto. He was arrived in the Soviet Union by a special airplane that Ehrenburg had convinced Stalin to allow him to use. And he came to the Soviet Union in 1944 and spent time with Hofshteyn. He would come back again in 1946. Sutzkever offers a revealing anecdote in his 1962 account of his meeting with the Soviet Yiddish writers. Peretz Markish apparently had hosted an evening at the Writers' Union in honor of Sutzkever's rescue. And Hofshteyn arrived late. I think Hofshteyn often arrived late to these things. And he insisted on reading a poem in Sutzkever's honor, which described an unnamed ergetz somewhere. And Sutzkever reproduced the poem in full, at least from his memory, nearly 2 decades later, on the pages of Golden Kate. And again, we have to take Sutzkever with a grain of salt because this is a long time afterwards. But the poem ends with these lines, according to Sutzkever. "Azoi viel Ergetzen hab ich gesehen bisher, und jenem Ergetz euch, ot dem was glanzt in jeder Trail." So I've seen so many somewheres before here, and that somewhere too, the one that sparkles in that tear. Sutzkever describes loud applause that follows, and he writes later, "We understood well which symbolic somewhere the poet meant. The illusion that he, Dovid Hofshteyn, had already seen the somewhere unveiled the poem's deception. The writer and the majority of those in the audience knew that Hofshteyn had spent beautiful months in 1925 in the land of Israel." Okay, we have to take Sutzkever's narration with some degree of circumspection. He was, after all, retelling the episode 18 years later, long after his own immigration to Palestine, and after the founding of the State of Israel. If Hofshteyn did read the poem, as Sutzkever recalls, that somewhere might also have been understood to reference the Soviet Union. I think we have to be a little bit careful about the way we interpret these things. Sutzkever later claimed that he confronted Hofshteyn about a poem that Hofshteyn had written to the Cossack hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And this is the leader of the Khmelnytsky uprisings in the 17th century, whose troops had decimated the Ukrainian-Jewish population in 1648. This was in the process of wresting Ukrainian territories from the Polish magnates. How could Hofshteyn, Sutzkever wanted to know, write a poem venerating the hetman with a sword outstretched to the east? This is all part of an article that Sutzkever published in the 60s. So most likely the poem in question refers to Hofshteyn's poem Denkmal Khmelnytsky, which appears midway through this 1936 book, Kiev. Sutzkever's memory is faulty. The poem doesn't include a reference to the east, but rather to the north, and the published poem is actually grammatically kind of inscrutable, but I've translated it literally here because I think it's inscrutable in a sort of interesting way. Ob Khmelnytsky gewinkt hat, kein Soffen ahin, und gemeint hat der Tsar und die britische Macht, hat dem Menschein zertrogen der frostiger Wind in die heldische Jahren von blutigen Schlacht. Und in mir ist die richtige Richtung gefunden, jeder Bürger von unser verbrüderten Land, weil in freilicher mir ihr Belohnung gewinnt, jede freie und ehrliche menschliche Hand. So roughly, if Khmelnytsky beckoned up there to the north, and the Tsar thought, and the powerful lords, or maybe what he really meant to write was, or meaning the Tsar and the powerful lords, the frosty wind, this meaning then scattered in heroic years of bloody battle. And in toil, the correct directions now found by every citizen of our brotherly land. In happy toil, the reward has been won by every free, honorable human hand. The poem is, needless to say, somewhat ambiguous. Hofshteyn's allusion to frosty winds, frostige Wind, that confuse the proper order of things, suggests the subsequent Russian cruelty against Ukrainians that followed Khmelnytsky's yielding of the Ukrainian territories to Muscovy in 1654. That the new Soviet citizens in toil, or in me, have resolved this Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood appears at first glance to be a renewed celebration of the brotherhood that Khmelnytsky had, whether reluctantly or willingly, established between the Ukrainian and Russian lands. So according to Sutzkever, after his criticism of Hofshteyn for writing a poem about Khmelnytsky at all, the latter brought him the poem, took Sutzkever into the washroom, where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by bugging in the apartment, and said, "Do you know what those lines mean? The sword is raised to us again, to us Jews." So this conversation actually makes a bit more sense if we apply it not to Sutzkever's misremembered line about a sword raised to the east, but rather to the line we have here, in which Khmelnytsky beckoned or gewinked to the north. So in this way, buried in Hofshteyn's portrayal of Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood is an anxiety about a renewed anti-Semitic sentiment infiltrating Russia. Sutzkever recalls in his article that following Hofshteyn's explanation, Sutzkever whispered, "Amarano." Hofshteyn is Amarano. Amaran. This interpretation of Hofshteyn's poem becomes a little bit more accessible if we return to Shevchenko, who in 1859 had admonished the great hetman in his poem that you see here on the slide, "Yak by tote Bogdana pyanle, teperna Pereyaslav Klyanov." If only you, drunken Bogdan, could look at Pereyaslav now. This line was edited out of most Soviet period editions of Shevchenko's work. It was the Brotherhood of Nations was very important to Soviet rhetoric about Khmelnytsky. For Shevchenko, whose oeuvre Hofshteyn knew as well as anyone did, Khmelnytsky was not a nation builder, but a compromiser whose 1654 treaty with Muscovy had led to centuries of Ukrainian subjugation. Hofshteyn's Khmelnytsky was Shevchenko's Khmelnytsky, a fateful unifier, a compromiser, a traitor. Placed in the middle of Hofshteyn's 1936 Kiev volume, this ungrammatical two-stanza poem, this is the entire thing, about confusion, was a poem about dangerous unions, about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I want to conclude by trying to draw a few comparisons to what is taking place today. And I realize that I'm threading a very precarious needle because the 1930s were years of alignment with Moscow. And today's Kremlin is bombing Ukraine, sometimes under the rhetoric of a Soviet-style internationalism. But what I see happening now is that the subversive solidarity that sometimes, and only sometimes, united Jews and Ukrainians during the Soviet years has become an important part of the post-Maidan Ukrainian space. An especially striking example of the use of poetic passwords can be found in this poem by Mariana Kianovska. This is from Kianovska's 2017 poetic cycle, Babyn Yar Holosami, Babyn Yar in Voices. It's now available to you in English translation through the Harvard Ukrainian Studies Press. Almost all of the voices in Kianovska's Babyn Yar are Jewish. And this passage, I believe, stands out for its merging of Ukrainian and Jewish voices. It's a kind of conversation between a Ukrainian person and a Jewish person, both of them dead. I think it holds a key for understanding not only this particular cycle of poems, but the larger phenomenon of what some people have called the civic turn. Ivan kaže Navi, Дивися, це місце немов Вавилон, але тут у нас перемішано не мови, а мовчання і кости, хоча деякі не перемішано я зі своїми з 33-го, ти зі своїми з 41-го, ви тут були новенькі. So this is a translation by Oksana Maksimchuk and Max Rzachinsky, which has just come out in full. Ivan says to Nava, this place resembles Babylon, except what's getting mixed are not languages, but silences, bones, even though bodies are kept separate. I, for one, hang on to my folks from 33, you to your newcomers from 41. I analyzed this poem in more detail in a special issue which Gabriela has co-edited of Comparative Literature. But what I believe Kianovska is doing here is quite explicitly unearthing competing buried traumas. By remembering 1941, the year of Babyn Yar, alongside the Ukrainian losses in 1933, the height of the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, she's initiating a conversation about how Ukrainian and Jewish post-memories, to use Marianne Hirsch's term, have developed in part in opposition to one another. She's also revealing how much is at stake for Ukrainians today and adopting the Jewish loss in Babyn Yar and other places as part of a history of Ukrainian tragedies. And for Kianovska, 33 is a password. It's a version of what I've discussed as passwords in my past book, also what Derrida, writing about Paul Celan, has called a cipher for an otherwise inaccessible experience. To quote Derrida, it's a word that opens the possibility of mourning what has been lost without remainder. So Kianovska, in turn, then uses this cipher, 1933, together with another historical cipher, 1941, to grant Jews access to the collective experience of Ukrainian loss. Kianovska is in some ways likening these communities to the language itself. You have this opening passage with, Ivan and Nava. They're actually, you can see in the Ukrainian, palindromic anagrams of one another. And you have also the movwe that becomes movchanya, so language becomes silence. They are mirror images that represent separate collective tragedies. Well, I believe it is, although the Soviet Union does not provide that many moments that we need to evoke or reference right now when we're talking about contemporary Ukraine, we do need to continue to go back to these moments of collectivity, of rapprochement, of generating passwords in order to generate a historical dialogue about two peoples who have been alienated. I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much for being here and for your attention.
Hi. I guess I'm very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about the writers other than Shevchenko, who are Ukrainian canonical writers who draw upon Jewish themes very regularly. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the ones that Hofshteyn translated, like Ivan Franko and Lucy. Yes. Leslie Ukrainka talks about Jews in her poetry a lot. And I guess I'm curious, this is sort of a broad question, but I'm curious if we can think of the way that those Ukrainian writers use sort of Jewish lore and Jewish people in their works. Can we think of Hofshteyn's translations as attempting to do the same with Ukrainian culture? Mm-hmm. Of course, they're in translation, so it's different. And I'm also curious if you think part of the reason that it appears in translations versus Ukrainian motifs, perhaps in his poems, is also censorship at the time, where many poets could translate instead of write. Yes. So just generally, if you could speak on that.
Yes, all of those things. So another poet, Hofshteyn was also translating his contemporaries. Yes, the 30s was both an age of internationalism and it was an age of translation. And part of the reason was the internationalism. It's time to get these other people into various languages, but it also was much safer to translate. We know that Pasternak was also translating Shevchenko at the time, and I do not like his translations nearly as well as I like Hofshteyn's, but they're good. They turn him into Pushkin kind of. And another of the poets that Hofshteyn was translating was Rilsky, who had himself translated Shalom Aleichem. So you have Ukrainian writers as well who are bringing Yiddish into Ukrainian and finding ways of talking about folk and collectivity and traditions. So you see it going in both directions. I think translation was, a kind of, itself, it was a kind of cipher for having a conversation about things that you couldn't have. I mean, the really classic example was, of course, Pasternak's translations from Georgian poetry, where he was able to talk about sort of silence and the difficulties of silence, but then, of course, he survived, but the Georgian poets that he translated didn't always survive. So it was safer for everyone if you translated someone who was already dead. So yeah, I'm kind of riffing on your question, but yeah, this was part of a large moment when translation was being built up. You'd had, this project of international literature that, everyone was supposed to translate everyone else. It was also a way of kind of talking about these cultures that were being lost. And it was a way of maybe escaping persecution for a little bit longer. Yeah. Shana, you had a question?
I'm trying to wrap my head around some of these political motivations and whether, so you use the word safety, right? Whether this is about establishing like Jewish safety vis-a-vis Ukrainians or Soviet power. I can't, so if this is about inserting Jews into this as sort of equal but slightly different a part of this territorial unit and establishing them as legitimate in the Soviet landscape, or if it's about using Ukrainian as a way to, because they can't get to Jewish, as this other analogous or password minority.
Yeah, okay, so both. Okay. Right, so on the one hand, it was a Trojan horse. Right, I absolutely believe it's a Trojan horse. And I had this conversation with there was like a Ukrainian journalist when this is in 2019, I was there talking about some of this material, and a journalist wanted to ask me about Hofshteyn. He was like, come on, Hofshteyn translated Shevchenko because he needed to make money. Like, clearly, he didn't care. He was just, whatever. He was just doing it. And I was like, I don't think so. Like, look at these translations. They're really good. I mean, he didn't, his Kiev poems are a hack job. He didn't even edit them. But his translations of Shevchenko are really careful. So he clearly, he clearly loved Shevchenko. I mean, he was in there, and you can see that. But it is a kind of Trojan horse for continuing to talk about the territory, talk about traditions. He'd chosen a writer who, obviously, everybody was choosing him because it was the big Shevchenko celebration time, but he happened to have chosen a writer who was writing about alienation in a very similar way to how he was writing about alienation privately to his friends. And I think this was, I truly believe that this was not an accident, that he kind of happened on Shevchenko as the person to really focus on. But, at the same time, by focusing on Shevchenko, he was also showing that Jews were really engaged in Ukrainian. So it solved a lot of internationalist, I don't know if they're problems, but it scored a lot of internationalist points, which was good for his career, but it also allowed him to have some deeper conversations that went beyond the censors. I hope that kind of answers the question. Yeah. So there were lots of reasons. It killed lots of birds with one stone, if that makes sense.
So I have a maybe unanswerable kind of conceptual question. I like how at the end you said, this is this moment when one thing that's worth looking back to in the Soviet experience, sort of Soviet literary history, and looking back to and maybe kind of reclaiming or reevaluating is the internationalism of the 20s and 30s. And at the same time, that internationalism is so, tainted.
Yeah, it's very tainted. It's in service to a great evil. Yeah.
And now you're finding in Kianovska this internationalism that you find to be heartfelt and politically relevant, terribly poignant. And I guess what I'm wondering is, to what degree can we compare one internationalism with another?
Yeah.
Are internationalisms the same? Is there such a thing as a kind of literary internationalism that we can untangle from political internationalisms? It's really huge. You could just answer any part of that.
It's really important what you're asking. So first of all, I think the age of internationalism, as I defined it in the last book, starts as internationalism because of Moscow, and it ends up as internationalism in spite of Moscow. And this happens in various places. So there's this excitement, there's this, idea that we're part of a revolutionary thing, and Jews are finally going to really, modernize and assimilate to something big, and let's write about all the injustices happening around the world. By the late 30s, Jews are starting to turn back in to worry about Jews again, which is, both tragic, right? Because they have to worry about Jews again, because Jews are under threat again. And it's also, sort of possible within their own framework of internationalism that they've established. So he had access as a Soviet writer to all these metaphors for Jewish suffering. But one of the things I'm trying to do, so I'm now writing this book. I started writing this book before the invasion last year about the civic turn in Ukrainian poetry, and how Ukrainian poets since the Maidan have been, becoming internationalist in a new way. And that was a really difficult needle to thread, because what I was basically saying is that, they're using passwords. They're doing something kind of similar to these pro-Moscow people in the 1930s, only they're doing it during a war that's being fought, in defense against Moscow. I think what I'm trying to do, and this is a really hard thing to do, but I'm still going to try to do it, is I would like to rescue the idea of an internationalist ethos that is humanitarian and that is, deeply empathetic from an idea of a Marxist-Leninism that has to reside in Moscow. Because I think that the ethos has traveled. I think the ethos was once there, and it was once aligned with this communist ideal and idealism, and there were plenty of Ukrainians that got behind it, and there were plenty of Jews that got behind it. And it doesn't have to be geopolitically centered in Moscow anymore. That idea that, the Russians are now fighting the good fight against the Nazis in the West doesn't make sense anymore, and it's time to shift the idea of what it means to be, thinking in an anti-nationalist way, in an anti-authoritarian way. And that's the kind of difficult gesture that I'm trying to make. And I was interviewed, at some point, like after the invasion last February, a year ago last February, a reporter from the Jacobin interviewed me about this book, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I really wanted to jump to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I realized that it was it was sort of a brave article that he ended up writing, because there are certain leftist venues that are having a hard time in the US mentally shifting away from the idea that Moscow still lays claim to anti-colonialism, even given the current kind of colonialist war that it's waging. And I think it's really important to start to shift that leftist thought.
Part of how Putin is so kind of, in some ways effectively addressing his message at the far left and the far right and reaching them.
But it also, I think it's an important distinction to make, because there are many who are sort of, worried about neoliberalism and stuff, who would compare the current self-defense of Ukraine to 1989. And I think there's a big difference between 1989 and this, what was, a necessary nationalist moment, to what's happening now, which is a moment of self-determinacy, but of a very civically minded state. Not everybody, but many people there.
In the 1920s, 1930s, actually, Jewish poets and writers were writing in Yiddish, in Russian, and in Ukraine. And what was the relations between those who were writing in Yiddish and those who were writing like Ilya Ehrenburg in Russian or some others?
Yeah. So Ehrenburg is an example of someone who had very close relations to people that were writing in Yiddish. We can credit him with rescuing Sutzkever and all of his papers from the woods where he was fighting with the partisans after escaping the Vilna Ghetto. There certainly were lots of ties between communities by World War II. I think that they were gradually increasing. My sense is that in Ukraine, the ties were tighter because you did have these connections between people that were involved in Ukrainian modernist movements and Yiddish modernist movements, especially in places like Kharkiv, where you had all of these journals that were publishing at the same time and then translating one another. So I think those, were maybe a little closer in Ukraine naturally than they were in places like Moscow. That's my sense, at least. But it's another, that's another field that I'd really love to dive into, is those other translations that were happening of their contemporaries. And they were often, Reute Welt, the journal that I showed you guys earlier that was published in Kharkiv, there were so many translations of Rilsky and Tychina, and all these writers who were writing in Ukrainian, some Jewish, some Ukrainian, some not Jewish, some translations from Russian.
Yiddish language poets, they were not trying to convert the non-Yiddish writing Jewish poets. So, there was no friction between them.
They weren't trying to.
Into Yiddishes.
Because some Jewish poets didn't write in Yiddish.
Yeah.
They could.
No, it's interesting. Hofshteyn actually is a really good example, and this is something else from Sutzkever's article about him. He was really in a very depressed period when Sutzkever met him midway through everybody must have been, right, 1944, who wasn't depressed. And he apparently said to Sutzkever that he'd been trying to write in Russian and Ukrainian, and his poems were being rejected from journals. So once you were a Yiddish writer, it was very hard to reestablish yourself as a Russian language writer or a Ukrainian language writer, but nobody in their right minds would have switched to writing in Yiddish, and the Yiddish writers knew that. So in a way, they were kind of siloed. There were a few people like Taif, this guy Taif, who was writing in Minsk after the war switched to Russian, because there were no more readers after World War II. Yeah, from what I know, I could be proven wrong if I find some example of someone who was like, "Come on, write in Yiddish," but I don't think people were trying to convince each other to write in Yiddish at that point.
Yeah, there's a famous novel. It'll come to me, but that was written in Yiddish and then translated into Russian about the war, about World War II. I'll remember anyway. But it just demonstrates your point that it only goes in the other direction.
But the disappearance of the magazines in Yiddish connected with the lack of stuff to publish, or it was policy, the Communist Party policy.
Right. So the magazines disappeared before the readers. The magazines were disappearing. Those avant-garde Yiddish journals were disappearing really, around the same time that all the proletarian institutions were being dissolved by Stalin. So at the moment of socialist realism, you lose, Pralit, which was this proletarian Yiddish journal published in Kharkiv, that, stops its publication. Reute Welt gradually ceases publication. Everything's being mainstreamed. And you have a few things that remain. You have Sovetish Heimland that would continue for a long time, but everything was being centralized. So the magazines disappeared, and then the readers disappeared. And there are certainly some people that, Hofshteyn was killed in 1952, the night of the murdered Yiddish poets in Lubyanka prison. He'd been arrested for purported Zionism. And there are some who have speculated they weren't needed anymore. During World War II, it was useful to have Yiddish writers around to rally support for the Soviet Union in the war effort. Then there were, when there were no longer Yiddish readers, why did you need the Yiddish writers? They just seemed dangerous. Which I tend to kind of buy that argument.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering about sort of where these translations went and what they did after publication. So I'm wondering, once let's say Hofshteyn comes out with a book of Taras Shevchenko or someone, there was a list of a couple of different translations. Mm-hmm. Do you see these as a means for these writers to sort of clarify for themselves, or write something that they're interested in writing through translation? Is it for kind of elite conversations between two people like Sutzkever and Hofshteyn that are in this very specific world, or do they show up in classrooms and curricula where state internationalism is?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the first translations he did was a book of children. It was a biography for children about Shevchenko, and he did the translations that were in that biography. That was for the curriculum. That was for the school curriculum to have the official Ukrainian writer should be inserted into the Yiddish curriculum. So what are you going to read in your Yiddish language Soviet school? Well, you're going to read a little bit of Pushkin, and you're going to read a little bit of Sholem Aleichem, and you're going to read a little bit of Shevchenko. It's definitely going to have to be an internationalist curriculum. And that's, that's really, these were all part of that, again, what Katie Clark calls the Great Appropriation, where all of these writers from earlier are made kosher, they're cleaned up, bad stuff about the Khmelnytsky alliance with the Tsar is taken out. It's all, exactly follows the party line. And so that was certainly all part of that, but who does he gravitate towards and how does he do them, right? These were not, you could do a hack job on a translation between Ukrainian and Yiddish and nobody's really going to notice. And these are not hack jobs. They're really rather lovely. And to me, that's the kind of the evidence that there's more to it. Yeah. Or than just the money that he has to make in order to live, or, the assignment in order to remain a party member. Yeah, or become a party member in his case. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you taken a close look at the language of the translation from the standpoint of co-territoriality of Yiddish and Ukrainian, and the choices? For example, though Yiddish is a Germanic language in its origin, it's also a language that incorporates words and even syntax from Slavic languages.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example, right? This bret politika lonkes and the lani shirokopole, that it's I mean, part of it is even kind of the syntax, right? This idea of the shoblani shirokopole, right? So the fields that are these, that are broad-skirted.
Amber waves of grain.
The amber waves of grain. Oh yeah, exactly. I should have translated it that way. I need to cut Fedinsky's perfectly reasonable translation and add one that's influenced by both. Yeah, I mean that Dumas. What I find really interesting. I mean, yes, absolutely. We also see. There's a wonderful example, I don't have it here, I think it's in Maria, his translation of Maria, which is really fun. It's, this is this long poem by Shevchenko about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And first of all, he translates it Miriam, which is I love that. It's sort of re-Judaizing Mary, but he also places Mary in this Ukrainian landscape. So she's I can't remember what the original Ukrainian is, but there's a space where she comes out all, ready to greet God, all dressed up in flowers, and he's beputzt mit Blumen. And he uses terms, often the words that he uses are, right, instead of, no, it's not with Blumen, with mit Kveiten, right? So he uses words that are influenced by the Ukrainian, kvite, for flower, he chooses that version of the word rather than the Germanic Blumen.
Because they're local flowers.
They're Ukrainian flowers, right? And she's a Ukrainian-Jewish woman, right? She's Miriam. I think he titles it Maria, but then within the poem, she's Miriam. So it's really, it's a great poem. It's a very, really, like Shevchenko also, it's a really, it's a sexualized version of kind of Mary and God and their affair. Yeah. All of you go run and read it under your covers at night. Yeah. Don't let your parents see.
In relation to the present day, how does Zelensky's Jewishness, how is it talked about currently, and how does it sort of influence both the discourse about present day Jewish-Ukrainian relations and also how people look back on this type of literature or this history?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so Zelensky's Jewishness?
Yes, how is it kind of taken up and how is it shaping the discourse both about present day Jewish-Ukrainian relations and the memory of this type of literature or this social moment?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I think, Zelensky's Jewishness is really kind of an interesting subject because, I mean, not so much because he's that Jewish, but because it's become increasingly highlighted. So it's sort of, he was just this guy who happened to have Jewish parents, and now it's then you see these things translated into Hebrew on his social media accounts. I think first of all, the fact that Zelensky was elected is important. It says something about where Ukraine is. It just didn't matter It's not so much that people are like, we want a Jew. It was that it didn't affect the fact that, he won, but with this landslide. Yeah, I mean, he's a very secular Jew. I think he may even be like baptized or something. I'm not sure, but that's Googleable. But he's, I think the fact that he's ethnically Jewish has been very important for the ability of Ukrainians to combat Kremlin rhetoric around, Ukrainian Nazism. They can easily be like, look, why would we have voted in a Jewish president? It's just a very easy talking point. But I also think it's, how do I say this? I think it's helped Ukraine remain a kind of civic space. I think war radicalizes people, and it can radicalize people in an ethno-nationalist direction. And I think the fact that there is this very good leader of war in power who is not an ethno-nationalist. In fact, he couldn't be an ethno-nationalist in precisely that way, has helped the country in that sense. And how does that reflect on this history? I mean, I think all of it is part of a kind of general turn to, which Ukraine was already headed in that direction even before the outbreak of the Donbass War in 2014. But I think there is a willingness and a desire to continue to prove accusations of Ukrainian anti-Semitism wrong. And that's not to say it's not there. There's anti-Semitism everywhere and whatever, this is a European country. But I think that happy coincidence of Zelensky's Jewishness has been a culturally helpful thing. Yeah.
Perhaps that is the point at which we should stop.
A good, yeah.
Yeah.
Bring it back.